Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. There are politics ahead, but we're going to start with war fighting tonight. Tom Joscelyn and Bill Roggio, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, are here. They keep the Long War Journal. There's a story up at the Wall Street Journal now. The CIA is claiming that the Russians are deliberately targeting the Free Syrian Army that has been developed by the CIA over this last year, 2 years of resistance against the Assad regime. I underline the surprise here is that the CIA is acknowledging that it has ops on the ground. That's a detail that's not obvious in this complaint. Heretofore, my understanding is that the CIA has been denying it has ops on the ground. The U.S. military is also trying or attempting to develop its ops on the ground, Free Syrian Army. However, the targeting of the anti-Assad forces in Syria is part of the story, and Tom Roggio will take us there when we travel to the al-Nusra front in western Syria. But we're going to start in Afghanistan. Over these last 72 hours, a tragedy in Afghanistan. A hospital, Doctors Without Borders, in Kunduz, was targeted by the American strike force of a C-130 gunship. This is a great big monster of a weapon that you use generally in conjoined with special forces. There is a changing story about how this targeting came about. The Doctors Without Borders is asserting that the Americans had their coordinates. They knew the GPS. And so when this was called in, how was it missed? There's also reporting that there was fighting around the hospital. That's now denied. There was also reporting that the Afghan forces targeted. That is now qualified by saying the American Special Forces might have been working with the Afghan forces. In other words, it's more than fog of war. There's a complete confusion of how this happened. It's a tragedy. It will be played out over many days because Doctors Without Borders is saying this is a war crime. They want an international investigation going forward. We'll see. We're going to start, however, in Afghanistan generally, big picture, because Bill Roggio has done us all the favor of putting a map of Afghanistan up at Long War Journal and identifying the districts, the parts of Afghanistan that are now in Taliban control. Bill, a very good evening to you. What I see on your map is that if this was a game of Chinese Go, the Taliban is surrounding major population centers. Let's start in the northeast, around Kunduz. What does the pattern tell you here about its strengths for the Taliban? Good evening, Bill.
Good evening, John, and thank you. Yes, and first and foremost, I want to be clear. This map, this is what we could tell from the open source. We believe that there's a large numbers of districts that are either Taliban contested or Taliban outright controlled by the Taliban. But a lot of the reporting from Afghanistan is beginning to go dark. So this map's put together based on either press reports or Taliban claims, which have been accurate in the past. So again, it's a best effort based on the information we have. I would argue there's far more districts. You could double. We have, I believe, 63 contested or controlled. You could probably reasonably double that, particularly in the east and in Kandahar province. But what this map up in the north tells us is the Taliban has made a major push and has devoted a lot of resources to taking over, particularly the provincial capital of Kunduz, and it's seeking to establish control of the borders with Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. It's very clear, the Taliban. So, and to me, this is a major failure of by the way, of the U.S. surge. The U.S. devoted nearly all of its resources during the surge to Helmand and Kandahar in the south, and the Taliban devoted a lot of said fine. We'll fight a rearguard action there, and we'll fight elsewhere. And I think you're seeing a direct result of that. They've made a lot of inroads up in the north. They took control of the provincial capital, which is a major propaganda coup. It's still contested to this day. Afghan officials are claiming they control most, if not all, of the city, but their claims have rung hollow. I think the Taliban really want to establish themselves up in the north and put a real dent in what should be a traditional base of power for the warlords.
Right. This is not the Pashtun part of Afghanistan. This is where Tajiks dominate. Other ethnicities dominate in the north, and the Taliban are establishing a fortress up here. But where are they being resupplied, Bill? From Pakistan or from Tajikistan and Uzbekistan?
I think it's probably a combination of both, but you could always count on our friends, the Pakistanis, to be supplying the Taliban. If you look in, these are tough supply routes. This is the real Hindu Kush up here, very, very mountainous areas, tough to get supplies in, up in Badishkan province, up through into Kunduz and the area around that. But I have no doubt that they're making it happen. But look, the Afghan government isn't even all that secure on the major supply lines going through Jalalabad. The Taliban have no lack of weapons. And also, by the way, what you see happening going in the north, it really puts to bed the idea that this is just a Pashtun insurgency. The Taliban have groups like the Islamic Jihad Union, and which has Tajiks and Uzbeks and Uyghurs and a whole host of nationalities are fighting with the Taliban. It's not just Pashtun. Even though that traditionally the minorities in Afghanistan have opposed the Taliban, it doesn't mean all of them. The Taliban have won enough to be able to wage an effective insurgency and take over a major city.
All right, we'll come back to Afghanistan in a moment. This is a vast battlefield, as we've talked about for more than 2 years now, and we need to go to Syria. This is the Al-Nusra Front. Tom, a very good evening to you. You have an item at Long War Journal about the Al-Nusra Front sending photos of Russian airstrikes. Where are these airstrikes, and can we tell, sending out these photographs, what Al-Nusra is trying to communicate to us? That they're under attack? Are they recruiting? Are they saying we're retreating? Good evening to you, Tom.
Good evening, John. Well, mainly the jihadis have been pretty quiet about exactly what's being hit by the Russians, and this may be because they don't want to actually give away the details of what the Russians are doing. The Russians are hitting, right now they're hitting multiple targets. Very few of the airstrikes are actually targeting the Islamic State or ISIS. Many of the airstrikes are actually targeting other rebel groups, including Nusra Front, which is Al-Qaeda's official branch in Syria, and some of its closest allies. But they're also targeting some CIA-backed groups, which are coming to light now, that are actually in Syria. And you mentioned earlier that there's this Wall Street Journal report that's out this evening, which I think is fairly remarkable because it's actually naming some of the groups that are receiving CIA assistance. Now, what's interesting about this is none of the groups that are being mentioned have really done a lot of damage to the Assad regime as far as we can tell of late. Basically, most of the damage that's been done to the Assad regime has come from the Jaish al-Fatah coalition, which is led by the Nusra Front and its closest jihadist allies, including another group called the Ahrar al-Sham. And the Russians are certainly going after them. But what this report from the Wall Street Journal shows is that, in fact, there are these CIA-backed groups that have received training, weapons, and other things from the CIA that are also being hit by the Russians. And the Wall Street Journal is citing U.S. officials who are saying that basically the Russians have been deliberately targeting these groups. So it isn't that they're just sort of hitting them by happenstance in the middle of a broader campaign. What they find is that the sequencing of the targeting by the Russians suggests that they've actually got intelligence and are deliberately targeting CIA-backed rebels in Syria. Now, this is very, very interesting. And of course, there's no evidence at this point that the U.S. is going to come to their aid or do anything to help them. So this is even more of a mess.
I want to go over this, Tom, carefully, because my understanding is that this is the first time we have confirmation from Washington, from the CIA, that they have CIA ops on the ground. I've not seen this confirmed before. In fact, I think I've seen it denied.
Well, the thing about this is we knew last year the CIA clearly had a footprint with some of these groups because what started happening is there's a group called Harakat Hazim which showed up with very sophisticated and expensive U.S.-made anti-tank tow missiles. And what happened was the Nusra Front, which is Al-Qaeda, saw that they were getting these missiles and decided, well, hey, we'd like them for ourselves. So they overran Harakat Hazim pretty quickly and took their weaponry and then used the weaponry in the siege in Idlib province where Nusra Front and its allies took over earlier this year. And so there have been indications like that where you can see clear American influence, clear CIA influence on the ground in Syria because obviously they're getting the American-made weapons from somebody, and obviously at some point in the production chain or supply chain is the CIA. But what's interesting about this, to your point, John, is that the details in the Wall Street Journal report are naming additional groups which I had not previously seen as being publicly identified as receiving CIA backing. And they're even naming some of the commanders in the report who were saying that their guys received some CIA training. So these are definitely new details.
And, Tom, did you see that suggestion in the paragraph near the bottom? The White House has succeeded at keeping man-pads out of Syria since the start of the war because of concerns they could fall into the wrong hands and be used against commercial aircraft in the region and beyond. Shall I read this as a roundabout way of saying man-pads are going back into Syria because of the effectiveness of the Russian airstrikes?
Well, I don't think they're going to send man-pads back in. I mean, I think the lesson from Harakat Hazim and other groups that have been backed by the CIA is if you send, I think if you read the quotes there toward the end of that piece, what they're saying is basically they're asking for these weapons to be sent into areas where Al-Qaeda is operating, and we're not going to do that because the problem is they already sent in these anti-tank tow missiles, and lo and behold, what happens is, yes, some of them were maintained in the possession of these so-called Free Syrian Army brigades, but we saw a good number of them end up in Al-Qaeda's hands very quickly, and then Al-Qaeda used them to basically, in their assault on Idlib earlier this year, to consolidate their control of territory in northwestern Syria. So the whole point here is you can't introduce these things into Syria when it's obvious that they could easily fall into Al-Qaeda's hands.
MANPADS, MANPADS stand for Man Portable Air Defense Systems. This is the shoulder-fired or team-fired weapon, very effective against aircraft attacking you. For example, Sukhoi 25s or Sukhoi 30s or Russian Mi-28 attack helicopter. Tom Joscelyn, Bill Roggio, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. When we come back, we're going back to Afghanistan, which is trembling for the Taliban attacks. I'm John Batchelor. I'm John Batchelor, Tom Joscelyn, Bill Roggio, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. They keep the Long War Journal. The war fighting is ferocious. There's lots of fog of war, but there's some details that Bill and Tom have been following, and we're going to move back to Afghanistan. The story is moving very quickly. We go to Badakhshan. Badakhshan is a district. It means Badak Mountains. It's Chinese, it's Tajik, it's Afghanistan. It's a little bit of everything, but right now there's a shadow governor there. The Taliban names its own governance, just whether or not the Afghan government has given up or ceded control of a district or a province. Bill, you have a report up that the shadow governor is denying his own death. Who claimed him as a KIA?
Yes, the Afghan Interior Ministry reported on Friday that Qari Fasihudin, who's the shadow governor or the jihadi in charge, what the Taliban call them, for Badakhshan province, was killed in a U.S. airstrike along with 40 fighters. The next day, the Taliban released an audio tape from him where he directly denied it. He gave the date and time and said these reports are false. So it's the second time, by the way, in the last week since the Kunduz was lost to the Taliban that the Afghan government claimed a shadow governor was killed. I believe it was the National Director for Security said that Mullah Salam, who, by the way, was in Pakistani custody and then released and returned to fight for the Taliban, they claimed he was killed in an airstrike as well, and he did the same thing. He came out and said, look, I'm alive. The Taliban are saying, look, the Afghan government this is their take on it. The Afghan government's so desperate that they have to show that in order to boost the morale, they have to claim we're dead, but we're not dead. So it's effective counter-propaganda.
It's the Ministry of the Interior making these claims. It's not anything. I don't know whether we have an ISAF office anymore, any way to confirm this. This is the Afghan government's statement that someone is dead, and the U.S. has no way to counter it or to fact-check them?
Yeah, so it's resolute support now is the right. NATO mission in Afghanistan, and they're very unhelpful with inquiries. Basically what they do is just refer you to the Afghan government. I don't recall the U.S. military announcing that they killed either shadow governor. So, yeah, this is primarily Afghan source. Now, keep in mind, I'm not trying to disparage everything the Afghans say. They were the ones that came out and said Mullah Omar was dead, and he really was alive, or that he was dead, and died 2 years ago, and the Taliban had to come out and admit it. But it's one thing when you release an audio tape, that directly refutes.
Bill, would this governor be critical to the holding of Kunduz, that he is a supply network for the fighters against the Afghan army?
Yeah, Qari Fasihudin, he controls about 1,000 men in 7 districts in Badakhshan. It's a very remote province, but what it forces he's going to be able to support operations in neighboring provinces, and I have no doubt that he probably sent men and material. But one of the things he helps do is helps tie down Afghan forces. The Afghan government wants to control the whole country, and when they have to go and fight in remote areas like Batchelor province, I mean, it's a very sparsely populated and very mountainous. When they have to go and fight there and commit resources to defend remote district centers so they could show that their writ is throughout the country, then it really ties down the Afghan military. It really ties their hands. It's less they could put into Kunduz or Helmand or any other place where the Taliban's on the offensive.
Tom, you have a report of the Islamic Jihad Union participating in Kunduz. What is the Islamic Jihad Union? What is the significance?
Well, the significance is that al-Qaeda basically groomed what we call their ethnic brigades from Central Asia and Western China. And these are brigades that are organized along the ethnicity of the jihadists. So you have one for Uzbeks, primarily in the Islamic Jihad Union, but also brings in Tajiks and other nationalities from Central Asia. And then there are also groups like the Eastern Turkestan Islamic Party, which is basically made up of Uyghurs from Western China, which is al-Qaeda affiliated. In fact, some of the senior members of this group are actually on the elite Shura Council of al-Qaeda. And then there's another group called Ansarullah, Jamaat Ansarullah, which is a Tajik, basically, brigade, which has also been groomed by al-Qaeda. All these groups have been participating in the Taliban offensive in the north. In fact, they've been participating on the Taliban chain of command. They're releasing statements saying that they're all participating and helping to capture these districts from Afghan forces. And the reason why we're reporting on this is because this is an important indication that what's happening here is that al-Qaeda actually is involved in this fight in a heavy way, in a very influential way, because each one of these groups has a distinctive dossier that's littered with al-Qaeda ties and shows that they were groomed by al-Qaeda to basically adopt their version of jihadism, going back to even prior to 9/11. In fact, one of these groups, I mentioned the Uyghurs, who from the Eastern Turkestan Islamic Party, they actually had training camps in the Tora Bora Mountains, right in one of al-Qaeda's last strongholds in late 2001. And some of the guys who ended up at Guantanamo were actually involved or were believed to participate in the Battle of Tora Bora. These are Uyghurs who were trained there. So basically, when we report on this stuff, why it's interesting or why it's important is because you can see that al-Qaeda groomed these Central Asian jihadist groups to take part in this offensive led by the Taliban.
There are photographs accompanying Tom's article showing the captured vehicles at Kunduz, including a UN vehicle, a Humvee, and a tank. Also pictures of the Taliban moving openly at the airport. Quickly, Bill, you have a report of 2 districts in the north being overrun. You tell me there's another district overrun. What is that? Yes.
The 2 districts were in Badakhshan province, and another was in Baghlan province, which is a little further south and east, but up in the north as well.
We have 30 seconds, Bill.
Karipalsula was leading the fight in the 2 districts in Badakhshan, and then the Taliban, that battle group, I guess I'd call it, they've been fighting not just in Kunduz province for the city, but they've been raiding in the neighboring provinces of Takhar and Baghlan. So it's, again, it's part of this big Taliban.
And they captured armored personnel carriers, heavy machine guns, mortar tubes, in other words, an arsenal from the Afghan security forces. Bill Roggio, Tom Joscelyn, the fighting continues in Afghanistan, fog of war. The fighting continues in Syria, same story. I'm John Batchelor.